Hi everyone, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce Sagan Yee. I've actually known Sagan since elementary school in Saskatoon, so we go back. Sagan is now executive director of the the Hand-Eye Society in Toronto, so doing arts and games and outreach with lots of different programs, such as Dames Making Games and Game Curious.
I'll go over the full programs. Dames Making Games is a separate organization, but I'm a member of that organization as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So lots of really cool outreach and engagement for gaming as art. Obviously, Sagan's going to be able to explain that better than I can, so I'll hand off to Sagan.
Cool, thank you. Super excited to be here. It's been a very long time since I last visited the Waterloo campus. And I don't think there was a games institute or any sort of program the last time I was here. So I'm very excited to see what everyone's working on. So for this talk, I'm just going to basically be talking a little bit about my background and where I'm coming from. I'm an experimental game designer. My background's in animation, and as Oliver mentioned, I run the Hand-Eye Society, which is a video game arts nonprofit dedicated to exploring and promoting games as an art form and a means of creative expression. And we also include the term playful media in there as well. That was a term that we borrowed from a maze festival in Berlin to just have a broader scope of what the medium is capable of. So not just limiting people's perceptions to digital games, but also like tabletop and interactive performance art and that sort of thing. So we're branching out a little bit, but we definitely started focused on video games primarily. So I'll just sort of go on this journey of my work alongside what's going on with the Hand-Eye Society and try to cap it off at about 30 minutes to give everyone time for questions and just start a dialogue with what everyone else is doing. So these are just some of the places that I've given talks at or presented work at. And it's really amazing how international the video game community is. If you work in video games and you happen to be going to South Africa or London, where I just was a couple weeks ago, or Berlin, there's games happening in every corner of the globe. So it's definitely a really great opportunity to travel and see what the scene is like in other places. This is I graduated from Sheridan's 4-year animation course in 2011, and so I never thought that I would end up in video games. Actually, that was sort of a complete accident. But I started out working on TV shows like stuff for the Disney Channel and Adult Swim, and shows that probably maybe your kids have seen if you have kids. But then I moved to Toronto after going to school in Oakville and immediately signed up for something called the Difference Engine Initiative, which was this one-time partnership between Hand-Eye Society, which was founded in 2009. I had never heard of it before, but it was between Hand-Eye Society and the Toronto International Film Festival. They had a program called TIFF Nexus, and this was TIFF's attempt to try and get more into the digital interactive media space. And so they were running something called the Difference Engine Initiative, which was a 6-week workshop aimed at women. So this was just when the conversation about making video games more inclusive and getting more women and people of color into the space was happening. So that was in 2011, and it was specifically geared towards women who had never made a game before. And I had grown up playing video games. I had never really imagined myself being in the position of making them or facilitating other people being able to make them. So this is when I made my first game. I made it in stencil, and it was sort of this it was sort of like an updated version of the Icarus myth. So if you know the Icarus legend, it's I think Greek, but the boy who had wax wings and flew too close to the sun. But it was actually more about him and his relationship with his genius inventor father and what it would be like to be cooped up on an island with that sort of person. So that was sort of the impetus for that project. And then later in that year, they actually asked me to co-coordinate the second version of the program. So they actually pulled 2 participants from the original program and had them lead the second one. So I thought that was like a really interesting way of doing things that sort of translated into the organizational work that I do now. And then I sort of started just collaborating with the people I had met through this program. So 2 of the participants from Difference Engine 2, Hannah and Alex, we made this very experimental dual-screened game-like experience that took place inside of a van. So we would sort of open up this, so there's 2 screens back there, and you kind of controlled it with an iPad, and we sort of shut you up in the back of this van that Hannah had bought off Craigslist, because that's the kind of artist that she was. She would just do these kind of zany things. And it was this very like artsy, very playing off of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, kind of glitch art kind of experiment that was about, the idea was that you go into this van and have this very psychedelic, kind of upsetting experience where this godlike AI is quizzing you and trying to convince you to upload your consciousness into the digital singularity, and so you're going to become one with this machine entity. And we also had sort of a performance element, so we kind of, this is not the kind of game where you could just download it off of Steam or itch.io or something like that. Like it was more of an installation piece. So we had a performance element where trying to convince people to get in the back of this van, and we had the sign saying free mind upload. So we just stand on the sidewalk and like try to convince people to get in there. And then also around this time I was at Dames Making Games Jam. So Dames Making Games is a feminist game arts organization that was kind of coming up at the same time. So they threw a game jam where I met this woman named Nadine Lesio, whose background is in maker spaces and maker technology, and she's a technologist. And so the first night they were kind of like, you know, this is where you find your collaborators and come up with ideas. And I had this game where it was like almost like an anti-dating sim where it was a visual novel where you've just cheated on your boyfriend and you're trying to lie your way through an evening with him and not get caught while you're like very stressed the whole time. And then Nadine had this, so she didn't have a game idea so much as a interface idea, and she had a makey and a set of throwing knives. So she is also able to throw knives as one does. And so she had this idea for a game board where you threw knives that would simulate button presses. So it was a makey hooked up to just a board with tinfoil in it. So when you threw the knife would complete the circuit and it would emulate a button press. And so she was like, I don't have a game idea, but I have this like weird knife throwing idea. And so I said, well, why not combine these 2 ideas and have the cheating simulator with the knife throwing interface. So in this scenario, the knife throwing became sort of a narrative metaphor for the stress of the situation. So you might be aiming for a really easy lie, but if your aim isn't right, you might end up hitting the truth and like accidentally spill the beans. So we thought that was sort of an interesting way of working in a mechanic that could have easily just been like throw knives at a dragon or something like that. Like obviously, like when you think of knives, that's a combat mechanic. It could have just easily been like a physical combat scenario, but in this case, it's an emotional narrative justification for the knife throwing. We showed this in a few public places, but we were never in a position to be able to let people play the actual game because you couldn't have people who had just been drinking, chucking knives at the screen. And this is the one I always like to tell that story because that's the one and only time a game has gotten the cops called on us. So the cops came and they made a beeline straight for us and they were like, what is going on here? Like someone must have told them that there was a knife throwing game upstairs. And then so from there, something a little less dangerous but still going along with the alternative controller theme. This was also with Nadine, but we also pulled in a bunch of our other maker friends. I was starting to get to know more of her crowd in Toronto. So this was another DMG jam, but we made sort of a magical girl alternative controller game called Punk Prism Power. So basically it's these laser cut peripherals. There's a wand and a chainsaw with hearts for blades, and they had LED lights, I think a gyroscope, there was I think a Bluetooth Arduino thing going on in there, and so it could, basically we made our own Wiimote because it could detect 3 different attacks. You could do a spin, a slash attack, and a sort of a downward stab. And this was also, I was learning Unity at the time, so I did most of the Unity stuff and kind of drew symbols to show the visual feedback of like how you know when you've successfully completed a move. I'm gonna see if this YouTube video works. So we actually managed to get pretty far with it, and it ended up being shown at Indiecade in LA in 2015 as part of their Night Games program. And Night Games is where they put basically all the games that are alternative controller games or physical games. It's outside in the parking lot, so you have a lot of room to swing those very dangerous acrylic weapons. If this doesn't play, then I will just move on. Yeah, I'll come back to this if we have time, because it's kind of cool. You can kind of see like a picture of what it looks like. We had a few hundred people, I think, come throughout the night. Like, it was very, very busy night, and we keep getting requests to show it at places, but it's just so much work to make an alternative controller game and like ship it around the world and all that sort of thing, and that's kind of the downside of alt controller games. This is one that we never actually finished, but we got far enough that Vice covered it. I don't know if they ever ran the story, but Vice came and picked it up. Again, a DMG jam, because we do this every year, but it was basically Twister, but it had dog shock collars. So Nadine wanted to do something with dog shock collars, so she kind of hacked them, and so you have to wear them while playing Twister, and it was also a metaphor for gentrification in Toronto in the housing market, because it had to do with like Twister. You can imagine Twister, but if like the board was getting smaller, so like if the amount of spaces that you were able to put your limbs on was getting smaller, that's kind of what the housing market was supposed to be. And the dog shot collar was supposed to be like just the pain of trying to navigate finding new spaces to live in when you're currently running out of options. So a few of the lessons and all of these games kind of had certain things in common. Like, they were all not traditional interfaces. This is when I started getting really into the idea of party games and spectacle games, where they are as much fun to watch as they are to play. So all of these games were meant to intrigue the bystanders who maybe didn't want to pick up a knife and throw things, or be a magical girl, or put on a dog shot collar and play Twister, but still be engaged on an observational level. We learned that nobody ever reads the tutorial, so a lot of these games that we had tutorial screens, especially for Punk Prism Power. We had a whole thing that told you what the goal was and everything, but like no one read it. They just sped on through, and it was a testament to the design of the game that it mostly worked out. They were mostly able to figure it out, but we did learn a lesson. Like, next time, let's not even bother to put in a tutorial. And most importantly, we learned that Twister is painful enough, like physically painful enough for adults, without adding electrocution into the mix. So we were trying to play just vanilla Twister, just to like, we need to get like the basic mechanics of what we're working with before we modify it. And it was like, this hurts already. And then you have this like dog shot collar that's like actually pretty painful. Like, we tested the shot collars as well. And maybe there's a reason we didn't get as far with that one as we did with the other ones, because playtesting was also like a highly unpleasant experience. So at this point, that was 2015 was Punk Prism Power. And then that was around the time when I started doing more stuff with Hand-Eye Society. So since 2011, I had been doing programming for Hand-Eye Society, and then at some point I was asked by the executive director, like, would you ever consider just taking it over? Because he had been in that role for like 5 years, going on 7, and I took a long time to think about it, but I ended up saying yes, because, you know, how often do you get the opportunity to be in charge of a video game arts organization, let alone one that's one of the most biggest and most established ones internationally of its kind. It's pretty unique. But alongside that, I started trying to tap into the Toronto and the Ontario Arts Council funding. So trying to actually, all the other projects had been just jam games that we elaborated on enough to have them at a few shows, and then we would never talk about them again. And then this one I kind of wanted to be a little bit more ambitious, do something on my own. Really wanted to bump up my Unity skills and also try and be part of the arts infrastructure that was happening at the time. Because like, even to this day, video game people don't really apply to the Arts Council funding. So there's like I think a lot of untapped resources out there that I try and encourage people to engage with more. Because otherwise it all goes to the film and video people, and we can't have that. So this is the project that I ended up getting some funding for. It's called Welcome to New Lex Plaza. It's still pretty work in progress. I've shown versions of it in exhibitions before, but it's very, I always describe it as a Vaporwave Star Fox 64 clone. If you don't know what Vaporwave is, you're kind of looking at what it generally looks like. Kind of like glitch art, kind of like early 90s deliberately bad CGI. Lots of pinks and purples, very drawing on sort of like an 80s aesthetic. But Vaporwave, I could write like a whole, I have done a whole other presentation specifically on Vaporwave, but it's kind of like a musical microgenre that kind of became an internet meme and then kind of just seeped into the public consciousness in a way that I feel like a lot of people don't realize that it happened. And I think of it as a what naturally happened after like the cyberpunk movement. So cyberpunk happened, and then I think Vaporwave was a natural follow-up to that, and now we're kind of coming back to cyberpunk again with like Blade Runner and all that. But Vaporwave, I feel like not enough people talk about it. So this, I actually started the game in 2013, which is when I was starting to, I wanted to basically make a clone of Star Fox 64, which was a game that I really enjoyed growing up, and of course brush up on my Unity. So I went through a bunch of tutorials. You can find them online. I think they were called Cooking with Unity. So they're these really long YouTube tutorials, and most of the time when you do a YouTube tutorial, it just shows you the perfect way of doing something. These tutorials were just two guys that would be like, okay, we're gonna make Star Fox today, and they would just leave the recorder on, and so there's like a 50-part series on how to make a Star Fox game because they spend like 3 episodes trying to make the barrel roll work and like figure out the math, and they don't cut out any of the mistakes that they made. So I would be following along. I didn't know how to code. I don't come from a programming background. I'm trying to learn C#, so I would type in exactly everything that was on screen, and then like 3 episodes later, they'd be like, "Oh, we screwed up. Like we've coded ourselves into a corner. Like we need to go back and fix it." So I would go back with them, and like, so that was actually it. It sounds like I learned the long way, but I think it was actually the shortest route to actually knowing how programming works and like what a mistake looks like, because you're not going to get that from like pitch perfect tutorials that only tell you the correct way of doing something. So these are just like pop-up ads that like if you fly through too many of them, it increases the spawn rate of the pop-up ads until it crashes the game. And that was a mistake, but maybe I might just leave it in there because I think it's a funny consequence that instead of just giving you a game over screen, it literally slows down your game until you can't play anymore. And so the last time I showed this was at the Reopen Closed Tabs exhibit, which was kind of about like millennial precarity and glitch art and sort of artistic irony and that sort of thing. And they had this sweet setup for my game where they kind of made it sort of this Frankenstein hodgepodge of technology where you're playing it on an N64 controller, but it's this clearly like really old ViewSonic monitor that the eras don't match up or anything like that. So we had some fun with that. The other offshoot of learning Unity in this way was that I started running this workshop called Exploring Weird Unity for Beginners. I actually have a link to the project folder up there if anyone's interested later. And it was very inspired by the sort of indie game movement that was taking off at this point because the tools were becoming so accessible. You could have these very bizarre projects, sometimes derogatorily called walking simulators. Paloma Dawkins, who made her first game through a Hand-Eye Society program as well. She made this game called Gardenarium and now does game stuff with the National Film Board of Canada, which is pretty sweet. So I would definitely look at her stuff if you're looking to see like who is sitting at that intersection of the art world and the game world. She does a really good job of that. And then the other big influence was Goblet Grotto by the Catamites and Cat Chastain, which is just like this delightfully bizarre pastiche of fantasy RPGs where everything is arbitrary, but like you still have the trappings of like you're ostensibly going around and killing things for points or goblets. You're just collecting goblets endlessly, and it's just very madcap, and the art looks like someone doodled it on the back of a notebook, which I think is great. And also co-op mode, which is a experimental game studio in Montreal. Their last release was called Gnog, G-N-O-G. And they had a Unity tutorial as well called Making Weird Things in Unity. So I kind of wanted to pay it forward and do my own version of that, because I think this kind of knowledge transference is super important. The idea basically was that instead of the way Unity is normally taught, so Unity can be pretty intimidating if you just opened it up. It's like Photoshop. Like if you aren't familiar with Photoshop, you're like, I don't know what any of these menus do, and I don't know what the language means. And like the Unity tutorials are pretty good, but if you start from that viewpoint, it's always like, well, we're gonna make a first-person shooter, we're gonna make a survival horror game, we're gonna make a Tetris clone, and it's like very basic sort of design patterns that I think sort of reinforce the kind of mainstream perception of games as they're all about like shooting things, or they're all about violence, or just puzzles or something like that. So I wanted to develop a way of teaching Unity that was like a lot more geared at artists who wanted to sort of use code as if you would use a paintbrush, like have that sort of intuitive way of working through a creative problem or getting to a creative goal, rather than just kind of doing the same thing over and over again. So this is me in a maze in Berlin teaching a bunch of people how to put videos on spheres, which is something that is ridiculously easy to do in Unity. It serves really no functional purpose, but I always use that as a starting example of like, here's a weird thing that you can do in Unity that's actually really easy to do. It's just drop a video on a sphere and then you can roll it around. So going off the sort of teaching people how to do things, this whole time I've been doing stuff for Hand-Eye Society, which, as I mentioned, was founded in 2009, so we're actually celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, which is really exciting. When Hand-Eye Society was first started, it was sort of with the mandate of bringing the idea of video games up out of the basement, really dispensing with, like, we're not even going to talk about our games art. Of course they're art, we're just going to assume that they are and then go from there instead of, you know, trying to bother answering the question. And now we've sort of just, that I think has become much more of a viewpoint that people understand. Like, I think that conversation, like our games art, are we going to argue with Roger Ebert about whether or not they're art? It doesn't really happen anymore, which is great. So now we're just kind of expanding on that original idea. And the original co-founders were all really multidisciplinary as well. So they came from zine making, they came from literature, they came from filmmaking, fashion, and it was a group of people that were all making games at the same time, and just they seem to have no boundaries between, you know, their primary disciplines or whatever they were doing at their day job and game making. Like, it was all kind of just the same creative thing, and I think that really informed the direction Hand-Eye Society went as it went on. So here are some of the people that we've kind of worked with, more on the Toronto local level, so a lot of media arts kind of people like Toronto Animated Image Society. We've done some stuff with AGO and TIFF. Community-based arts like Art Starts. We love working with the libraries because they're everywhere and they love sharing knowledge with a whole bunch of diverse audiences, and it's a really good opportunity for us to explore other parts of the city other than the downtown core, because the library branches are in every part of the city. Toronto Comic Arts Festival, we've had a really long-standing partnership with them. Vector Festival, and like a lot of film festivals actually who seem to want to always have a little extra something other than movies. I think they realize the landscape is sort of changing around the primacy of filmmaking as an art form. So not dispensing with it at all, but just like adding something to that experience. And then a lot of international friends as well. So Dirty Rectangle is in Ottawa. You have Pig Squad that's over in Portland. Wild Rumpus from the UK. We partnered with them for our first annual fancy video game party. Baby Castles in New York. So Amaze, I mentioned. Huegos Rancheros, they're in Austin. They're really great. So if you're ever traveling to like any of these places, there's probably a directory of gaming arts collectives that you can look up, and they're pretty good about, you know, if you say that you're in town, then they'll try to get people out to like show you around and show you a good time. So this is sort of part of older presentations I've given about Hand-Eye Society's mandate, but again, it was trying to move people's perception of games away from the Call of Duties and the Grand Theft Autos and casual mobile games and retro games. Those are kind of like the three sort of categories that people would tend to fit video games into if they didn't know that anything else was out there. So if you don't make the effort to go, the idea was that if you don't make the effort to go to these people and say there are other things out there and here's the grand array of experiences and creativity, like the range that's out there, then you know they might never discover it on their own. So it's not to say that any of these types of games are bad in any way. Like there's amazing games in all of these categories, but it was just to expand people's perceptions to include more games along these lines. So these are more or less all made. These are all games that were all made in Toronto or Toronto adjacent. Like maybe they started making the game in Toronto but have moved on elsewhere. Like Ben Gelinas, I think he used to work for BioWare and then was in Toronto for a bit, and he made this just like weird game called Speed Dating for Ghosts. And I think he's in New York now, but I think he made this game while he was in Toronto. N++ by MetaNet Studios. They're Toronto-based, and they were actually one of the original co-founders of Hand-Eye Society. Snow by Benjamin Rivers. That one's pretty old. It even predates Hand-Eye Society, back when the co-founders were running the Artsy Games incubators, which were almost like a writer's circle, but for game makers. So even before Hand-Eye Society, the co-founders would have these socials and opportunities for people to make their first game or work on a project. So Snow came out of that. And it's sort of a slice of life game where you're just this like young woman who kind of has low self-esteem issues, and you're just trying to get through the day, and it's like it takes the form of a point and click adventure, but the fact that it has this very almost autobiographical feeling vibe to it, just a very personal kind of story. I always like to bring that one up. A Mortician's Tale is quite recent, and that one is a mortician simulator where you learn about the process of preparing a body for a funeral, and it's specifically a death positive game that's supposed to like sort of destigmatize death and the process around it, and make it like a little more transparent to people so they're not just like freaked out by it or think it's gross. And Jazz Punk is really wonderful. It's kind of an under the radar game by a friend of ours, Luis Hernandez. And I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like William Gibson meets Naked Gun in Legoland kind of a vibe. So it's like a parody of cyberpunk, but also everything else. It's a parody of everything, but with like very faux cyberpunk trappings. And it's just a really delightful comedy game. It's also a rare example of a game that is comedic, like straight up comedy. There's probably more examples now than when it first came out, but just an early precursor to that. And then Game Curious was kind of the big program that I did before taking over Hand-Eye Society completely. They kind of gave me free rein to do with it whatever I wanted. We actually got a multi-year Trillium grant from the Ontario government to run it because they liked it so much. Basically, the premise was actually really simple. All it was a program designed at people who didn't identify as gamers, and that was like the basic pitch. And so that seems like kind of a weird way of phrasing it, but you realize a lot of people do not identify themselves as gamers, and gamers, like as a word, is pretty insular, just by the especially now, like after Gamergate and like the rise of the alt-right in gamer spaces and stuff. I feel like the word gamer has, like, I feel like people aren't trying to reclaim it, at least not in the spaces I run in. It's kind of like, let's go the other way and just expand who are the people that play games or could potentially be playing games. And it was called Game Curious because we're trying to reach out to people who might be curious about games, maybe they play games or maybe they don't. but they are curious about the medium as it is and where it might be in the future. So back in 2013, when I was developing the program, I sort of came up with this bingo card of like, okay, so if I was in the position of someone who doesn't play games, what are all the reasons I could have to not play a game? And I came up with quite a few reasons, some of which I share, and a lot of people who do play games will look at this bingo card and say like, that's the reason I also don't play a lot of video games, or not as many as I would like to. So just stuff like maybe people get motion sickness because the games have not been calibrated to be accessible. Maybe they're sexist, people think they're a waste of time. Maybe people used to play, but they don't anymore. That seems to be a really common one. Like we run into a lot of people that come to the Game Curious events and they're like, oh, I used to play all the time and I like owned the original Pong machine or something like that. Or like they remember arcades, but then for whatever reason, as they got older, they just stopped seeing it as an option to continue being part of their life. And so Game Curious was kind of like sort of low-key, not challenging people, but asking them to sort of revisit the question of like, why don't you anymore? And maybe that possibility could still be in your future. And also drawing a lot from the sort of, I call them like small games, SMOL games, or zine-like games. So these are games probably not even made in Unity necessarily, maybe more something like Twine or Scratch, or Bitsy is a new one, which I'll show a screenshot of, but just like really small bite-sized games where the process of making them and the process of distributing them is way more like the way that you would make a zine. So it's like one person, they maybe knock it out in an hour or two. It's very raw, very personal, or it's just like very stream of consciousness or weird, whatever comes off to the top of their head. And then the way they distribute it is they just stick it on a site like itch.io, or they tweet about it, and maybe people play it and share it, or maybe they don't, and it's all kind of not very tied into the bigger industry concerns. Like we're not going to put it on Steam or anything and have to deal with people's comments around that. So when teaching, we do run some workshops that are more like on this level of things, where it's like you're going to learn Scratch, you're going to be learning Twine, which is really big for writers. Or Bitsy is the new player on the scene, which not as many people have heard of, but I really like this one because I feel like it sort of gets to the heart of like when people want to make a small game, like something like Bitsy is often what they have in mind, and so I'm really happy that someone came up with a tool for people to just make a game where you're in a sort of atmospheric space and you go around and talk to people, and maybe you can pick up items and have like a very light inventory system. And for a lot of people, that's like all they need. And it has that sort of lo-fi graphical quality that you don't get with Twine necessarily. So for people who are maybe a little bit more visual or want to make something visually atmospheric, it's really good for that. And then some of our other initiatives, just going to go through them real quick. We have, this is at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. We have this sort of partnership with them where we have a small arcade that we curate every year. This year, I believe it's May 11th to 12th, so you're in town, I highly recommend checking it out. And it's like, it's a huge international festival, and thousands of people come through the library space every year. And then so it's really great that we can have an arcade and showcase games that sort of sit at the intersection of Comics X Games. I think we actually have the guy who made Gorogoa, if anyone has played that. Highly recommend it. It's an amazing, brilliant game that synthesizes video games and comics. So it's like 4 panels. It's a puzzle game, but it's beautiful. I'll try and throw up a picture if I have time. Hand-Eye Society Ball is our annual fancy video game party. It's kind of like a fundraiser, but more of an excuse to just throw a party that sort of showcases more of those party games, the spectacle games, the old controller games. That is kind of where my heart lies. And it's also international, so we'll get people, most of the time when we curate stuff, we try to sort of have a local focus, but this one we kind of open the doors to people around the world to show off what they've been working on. We had Cuphead one year, which was like, that was before it was released, and people were super excited about that. That was like 2 years before it actually came out, and so people got like a sneak preview of it. Wordplay is our annual festival. It's usually in November for interactive fiction, text-based games, and storytelling in games. So that one's really good if you're like into narrative design or like even something like obscure like parser-based fiction. Last year we had our keynote speaker was the editor of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which is it's an anthology game. It was 26 different writers that contributed to it, and so it's a game where you're sort of traveling through this magical realism 1930s Depression era America, and it's about manifest destiny and colonization, and it's really wonderful. We have workshops, we have weird one-off events, I have a friend at TIFF who has this weird film festival called the What the Film Festival, so we usually try to do some kind of collaboration about FMV games and how bad they were. And then, yeah, we have some Trontrons, we have some vintage arcade cabinets that have been repurposed to play games made by local creators. Can't make a game, that one's more for kids, but every time we describe it to people, they're like, can you make one for adults? Because it sounds like a lot of fun. So it's a game design summer camp, but half of it is screen-based digital learning, and then the other half is outdoors. So you're sort of modding physical games with folk games, like you can take tag and then recombobulate the rules and make something new. We had a project called the Toronto Video Game Database Project that isn't, it was a research grant from, it used to be called the Ontario Media Development Corporation, but they are Ontario Creates now. And this is just sort of like the IMDb, but for video games made in Toronto. So it's very specific, but it was kind of a cool way to, the idea was that you could just put it down in front of someone who's like, I don't know anything about indie games or like what's being made in the community. You could just put that down in front of someone and they could immediately jump into discovering new things. Okay, I'll just wrap it up real quickly. I will say a little bit about the Hand-Eye Society ball. So we were experimenting with the format of this particular event. Last year we tried to make a meta game that could be played by all 600 attendees. So that was a real exercise in like, how do you make a game that's robust enough to include different levels of engagement of like people who just want to socialize, people who want to do side quests. We had improv actors involved. We made like 600 LED bow ties that were 4 different colors, and then as people came in the door, we'd randomize what color they got. So they were all divided into 4 factions. We had an LED leaderboard showing each of the house factions, so it's kind of like a Harry Potter competitive thing where they were all competing for points, and they could get points by playing the games. Or we had side quests, so we had act like NPCs almost, like dress up in black, and they would have these little pieces of paper that would say things like turn to the person next to you and give the secret Hand-Eye Society handshake. And it's, of course, there is no such thing as the secret Hand-Eye Society handshake, but you would watch people like try to make up the most elaborate thing they could on the spot with the stranger next to them, and then they would get points that in the form of playing cards, which they could then deposit and try and get points that the improv actors would then act out, like who was in the lead. So every hour there would be a performance. So anyway, we were planning to do some kind of like blog post or just like post-mortem of the whole thing, because designing something on that level we'd never really done before, and it went over really well. So this year we're going to try something with a co-op model where it's all 600 people, but they're up against like the same bad guy. So almost like a pandemic kind of a thing, I guess, like all the players versus the game, basically. And it'll be sort of an eldritch horror vibe, like some elder god has been awakened and everyone has to stop it. This might be of interest to people maybe more on the academic or the sociological side of game making. But this is a paper that hasn't been released yet. I just want to bring it to your attention so that when it comes out, you can look for it. It's called Autonomy, Integration, and the Work of Cultural Intermediation in Indie Games. But basically, it's about trying to solve the problem of the missing producer in indie game making teams. So the sort of holy trifecta of indie game making is you have the artist, you've got the programmer, and you've got the designer. For some reason, they don't include audio in there, but just the core group of people who is normally producing video games on the production side of things. And then the cultural intermediaries are all playing the role of like, well, who's producing, who's doing the marketing, who's doing the networking, who's creating the connections for groups to meet people and get their work out there or find collaborators. And that's sort of, then we were invited to be part of this conference called Indie Interfaces, where they identified Hand-Eye Society as being one of those cultural intermediaries. All the games festivals like GDC and co-working spaces all belong in that category. Hand-Eye Society and Pig Squad and Dave's Making Games, all cultural intermediaries. So I thought that was like a really interesting way of looking at the work that we do, which I had never really thought about, but when they sort of elaborated on it, I was like, oh yeah, that is kind of our purpose. And then the last thing I will talk about is just, I was in London, England, the last few weeks ago, to visit the Play, Design, Disrupt video game exhibit at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So this was a big deal because the Victoria and Albert Museum, like, this is what it looks like. It's a huge, very institutional, beautiful space, and the fact that they have opened it up to video games is a really big deal. I think even more so than when video games were at the MoMA, because this is focused on, the interesting thing, the angle that they went with this was they wanted to show video games as a design object and as a contemporary art form, whereas with the MoMA, they kind of threw in like, we're going to look at, you got Mario, and then maybe Shadow of the Colossus. I think they had Cannibalt in there. And then this is sort of like building on that work and sort of, again, games are art, and now we're going to like, we're up here in the conversation at this point. And I also think that the way that they presented the games was very interesting, because you always have this problem when you're presenting video games in any sort of space. Almost always it's just a bunch of monitors stuffed into a room with keyboards and mice, and it's like really boring and like not that inviting, and it like there's no like you have to read some instructions that someone has like scribbled on a piece of paper, like is it a WASD or do you use the arrow keys or something like that. So they have almost like they had trackballs instead of mice, and like almost these custom keyboards that I thought were really interesting. And just like these like custom arcade cabinets that they had commissioned artists to like build. I think that's like sort of the ideal way if we were to do more public events where we're showing games. It'd be nice to get out of the bunch of anonymous monitors stuffed into a space mentality. Mostly for lack of resources on our end that we haven't been able to do it any other way. This was like a budget of like £2 million or something like that. They had money on their side. And I also got to hang out with Robin Baumgarten, who if you are interested in alternative controller games, definitely check out Robin Baumgarten. He made a very well-known game called Line Wobbler, which is a game that's played on a really long LED strip, and it's a one-dimensional dungeon crawler, and you play it with a door stopper. He's obsessed with door stoppers, so you can use the door stopper to move a point of light, and then you have to wibble it to become invincible for a short period of time. And the red lights are like enemies, and you kind of get this sense of like, oh, these are lava puddles and everything, but it's just one long strip of LED lights, and that's all it is. And now he's making another one called Wobble Garden, which is just a bunch of wobble door stoppers, and you have to like put your fingers on them and wobble them in different configurations. And then he teamed up with, don't remember the university, but basically they had quantum scientists or quantum computational people, and they were like, can you make a version of Wobble Garden that shows a visualization of this quantum algorithm that we've been working on? So that's the kind of partnerships that he's involved with. I'm like, he has such a cool job. This is like all he does now. And people commission him to do weird art stuff like that. And yeah, I'll skip over this because it's not that interesting. But I will leave it there, I think. That's kind of up to speed on what I've been up to, what Hand-Eye Society has been up to. And if there's any questions, I would love to, or I'd love to just hear what everyone else here is working on. Like, I don't know if there's are there any people like who specialize in alt controller games or narrative games or What's the focus?
Asymmetric games.
Asymmetric games? Cool.
I think we should clap for you first.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Next big thing is probably, so we got a grant to do programming at Evergreen Brickworks. I don't know if people are familiar with that space. It's more of a Toronto thing, but there's the Don Valley River, and then Evergreen Brickworks used to be a brick factory that basically manufactured all the bricks that made old Toronto. So probably a lot of those buildings are still around. But then the brick factory closed down and then got converted into sort of this environmental urban renewal center. So like really almost like a research center where people could come and learn about ecological issues or urban renewal issues of sustainability. And yeah, that's what they are now, and it's really cool. And so we're going to be in there. We're going to be doing a game jam that's sort of trying to. So it's an interesting space. They warned us that it floods periodically. Like it's like and
Turn that into a game.
yeah, and like power is kind of like sporadic, and it's really like because of the nature focus and where it's located. It's like in the valley where there's like a lot of hiking trails and like really close to nature and all that sort of thing. We really wanted an initiative that would take people's idea of games and play away from the digital space, away from screen-based technologies, and more into like what is a game, what is play, what are systems, like how do you take the systems, putting people in an environment where they can learn about systems of ecology and environments and that sort of a thing. Aquaponics, they have like a great aquaponics farm, beekeeping, all of that sort of thing. All these interlocking systems of people and nature and things and cities, and like how do you translate that into something that's like interactive or playable in a way that's not just like, I'm not a huge fan of just like games that just educate you on something. Like I like more games where you're sort of more embodied in the system that's being represented, and so you can kind of see it in a very more artistic way rather than like here's a bunch of facts, or like now you do a quiz and you're learning about the Oregon Trail and what diseases people have and stuff like that. So that's there's a bunch of initiatives around that. I wonder if I can just actually bring it up. So this was we had a call for submissions, so that's over now, and I'm in the middle of picking people for it. So it's for 6 people, and we're just going to like concentrate on those 6 people and delivering a good experience for them. And so the final product is actually going to be a zine. So instead of a game that you can play on your phone or a console or whatever, it's just going to be like they can make a story, they can make rule sets. They can come up with whatever they want. It just has to be like in a zine format. So almost like they can generate ideas of games that might not even be playable in real life. So my starting example was like, okay, so what if you could identify all of the bricks that were made at the original Brickworks? What if you could like go out into Toronto and find all those bricks? And what if you played Jenga with those bricks? Like, would there be enough bricks still in Toronto to be able to play Jenga with them? Like, would Toronto just simply collapse if you took all those bricks out? And so that kind of puts people in a space where like, okay, that's like a game that's like almost playing with the idea of a game rather than making a game almost. So that's kind of the idea that we're going with. And then summer, we're doing alternative controller games in the Children's Garden, trying to make some kind of like Star Trek tricorders where people can like get the temperature of the compost pile or something like that. And like, why is it hotter than the rest of the environment? And do some sciencey things. Fall is going to be interesting because it's Jen Sandercock's Edible Games Cookbook is coming out. So these are games that you can play. So you bake them, or you make them, or you cook them, or whatever. And they're games that are designed to be like eaten as you play. So we've been play testing that for her, and then we're going to. So I ordered 2 copies, and then one of them is probably going to be the one that we end up using for the fall session. And then, yeah, winter we're still not sure about. We have like a game designer that and some artists that are going to be doing something like an ice sculpture, but it's related to climate change. It's also going to be a game somehow. We're like still trying to figure it out. But yeah, if you are interested in keeping up with what we do have a monthly newsletter that we mail out to everyone on our list every month, and it sort of aggregates all of the gaming events, trying to focus more on the arts and culture side of things rather than sort of the nerd geek type of realm. But we normally try to like put everything in there. So just like everything that's going to happen in the month of March, if you go onto our newsletter, you can see all of that. You can also go to join the society and then newsletter subscription, and then like if you fill out this info, then you'll be subscribed to our mailing list, and then you'll get everything that's on our news blog. So this is March's newsletter, and then it's just Game Gallery just happened. That was really fun. I don't know why there's a GIF of Chucky up there, but yeah, it's like it just tells you the dates and kind of a link of what's happening and some news that's happening elsewhere in the world and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, so I mean, one of the formats might be, I mean, you know a bit about what I'm working on, and so hopefully I can show a little bit more details of what we're working on for haptics, which could be...
Yeah, no, I'd love to see what everyone's working on.
So maybe I'll just like sit in silence for another second and see if anyone else has any specific questions for the large group format. Otherwise, we may do like more breakout groups and kind of do a quick tour around everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Some one-on-one time for the next like hour or so.
I will say if people are working on games, like we have open submissions a lot. Like that's one reason to sign up to our thing is we have open submissions to a lot of our events. So Comic Sex Games, Wordplay, Hand-Eye Society Ball. We're always looking for stuff to showcase. So if you have something that you're really proud of and would like to show it off to a ton of people, please send it our way. And we also pay artist fees, so you get some money most of the time.
There are no other questions. Then yeah, let's thank Sagan again.
Thank you.